Swamp is not a word that people use when they are giving you something valuable. Swamp is the word people use when they are giving you something they want to stop owning. The way a man hands you a bucket with a hole in the bottom and calls it a gift. The way a woman gives you a dress with a stain on the front and calls it a kindness. Swamp means water where water should not be, ground that is not ground, soil that is not soil, but a suspension of mud and root and decomposing leaf that will swallow a boot to the ankle and a fence post to the knee and a woman's hope to whatever depth hope reaches before it drowns. Harlan Whitmore used the word with precision. 17 acres of swamp, he said, and the way he said it made clear that the 17 acres were not a gift but a disposal. The removal of an unwanted daughter-in-law accomplished through the transfer of an unwanted property. The transaction designed so that Harlan could tell the church he had been generous, while Lorena could tell no one because Lorena was being sent to a swamp, and swamps do not have churches. The family gathered in the parlor of the Whitmore farmhouse on the morning of March 14, 1885. The room smelled of wood smoke and beeswax and something else, something that might have been anticipation, something that might have been cruelty dressed in Sunday clothes. Harlan stood by the fireplace with a document in his hand, reading it aloud the way a judge reads a sentence. His voice filled the room like smoke curling into corners, settling into the grain of the floorboards. He was 62 years old, and his face had the weathered quality of a man who had spent his life demanding things from soil and people and getting what he demanded. Permelia sat in her high-backed chair with her hands folded in her lap. Her face was arranged in an expression of sorrowful duty, the expression of a woman who is doing something difficult because it must be done. She wore black as she always did, though no one in the family had died in 17 years. Permelia believed that life itself was a kind of mourning, and she dressed accordingly. Ephraim stood by the window with his back to the room, looking out at the fields he would inherit. The fields his wife and daughters would never see again. His shoulders were hunched, his hands were in his pockets. His reflection in the glass showed a face that was looking at nothing, and Lorena stood in the center of the room with Willa clutching her skirt on one side and Hetty balanced on her hip on the other. Listening to her father-in-law explain that her marriage had failed, not in those words exactly. Harlan Whitmore was a man who understood the power of euphemism. He spoke of biological disappointment. He spoke of the Whitmore legacy and the necessity of male heirs. He spoke of 5 years of patience and prayer and the unfortunate reality that some women are simply not capable of producing sons. He did not mention that Lorena had produced 2 daughters. He did not mention that she had been pregnant with sons twice and lost them both, once in the 5th month and once in the 7th. Losses that had nearly killed her and that Permelia had called divine judgment rather than medical tragedy. He did not mention any of this because daughters were not relevant to the Whitmore legacy and miscarriages were evidence of weakness, and weakness was not something the Whitmore family acknowledged in its own bloodline. What Harlan mentioned was the deed. 17 acres along Willow Creek in the southern bottomlands of Perry County, Tennessee. Property that had belonged to the Whitmore family for 40 years. Property that no one had ever successfully farmed because it was not farmland. It was swamp. A gift, Harlan called it. A final act of generosity from a family that had given Lorena 5 years of shelter and opportunity and that could not in good conscience send her away with nothing. Permelia nodded at this. Permelia, who had made Lorena eat in the kitchen while the family ate in the dining room. Permelia, who had called Willa a disappointment on the day she was born because Willa had been born female. Permelia, who had looked at Hetty in her cradle and said that at least this one was quiet, as though silence were the best thing a daughter could offer. Permelia nodded and said that the Whitmore family had always been charitable. 17 acres of swamp for a woman who could not produce an heir. Permelia added, it seems fitting, like for like. The words hung in the air like smoke from a fire that would not stop burning. And Ephraim. Ephraim stood at the window with his back to his wife and his daughters, his shoulders hunched, his hands in his pockets, his reflection in the glass showing a face that was looking at nothing. He did not speak. He did not turn around. He did not do what a husband is supposed to do when his family is being cast out, which is to object. He simply stood there. Because Ephraim Whitmore was 29 years old and had never once in his life contradicted his father. Because Ephraim loved Lorena and loved his daughters, but loved them in the way that weak men love, which is to say that he loved them until loving them required courage, and then his love simply stopped. Lorena watched his reflection in the window glass and understood that she was alone. She had been alone for 5 years. She simply had not allowed herself to know it until now. She remembered the day she had met him, a church social in the spring of 1879. He had been handsome then, confident. He had told her that he would protect her, that she would never want for anything, that he would stand between her and the world. She had believed him. She had been 20 years old and she had believed him because believing was easier than questioning, and because his family had land and her family had nothing, and because love when you are 20 feels like something that will last forever. It had lasted 6 years of standing in the kitchen while the family ate in the dining room. 6 years of being told that her daughters were disappointments. 6 years of watching her husband choose his father over her again and again until the choosing became invisible, until it was simply the way things were. And now she stood in the center of the parlor with her children pressed against her and her husband's back turned to her and her father-in-law reading a document that would send her to a place designed to destroy her. Willa tugged at her skirt. Mama, the 4-year-old, whispered. Why is grandfather making that face? Lorena did not answer. She was looking at the deed in Harlan's hand, at the words written on it, at the signatures at the bottom. She was calculating. She was a woman who had learned to calculate quickly because calculation was the only weapon she had. 17 acres, swamp, 4 miles from the nearest neighbor, 6 miles from town. No road, only a track. No cabin, only whatever she could build. No help, only whatever she could provide for herself. And 2 daughters, 4 years old and 2 years old. Children who needed to be fed and sheltered and protected from a world that had already decided they were worthless because they had been born in the wrong sex. Harlan finished reading the deed and held it out. This concludes the matter, he said. You may collect your belongings from the servants' quarters. The wagon will take you as far as the creek crossing. After that, you will have to proceed on foot. Lorena felt Willa's small hand tighten on her skirt. She felt Hetty shift on her hip, restless, too young to understand what was happening, but old enough to sense that something was wrong. She looked at Permelia. She looked at Harlan. She looked at the reflection of her husband in the window, the man who would not turn around. And then she reached out and took the deed from Harlan's hand. I accept, Lorena said, and I will not forget. She did not raise her voice. She did not cry. She did not give them the satisfaction of seeing her break. She simply turned and walked out of the parlor with the deed in one hand and her daughter on her hip and her other daughter clutching her skirt. And she did not look back. The hallway was long and dark and smelled of furniture polish and old money. Lorena walked it with her head high, her footsteps steady on the hardwood floor. Behind her, she could hear Permelia saying something to Harlan. She could hear Harlan's rumbling reply. She could not hear Ephraim. Ephraim had said nothing. Ephraim had done nothing. Ephraim would continue to say nothing and do nothing for the rest of his life, because that was the kind of man Ephraim was. Willa wanted to bring her doll, the porcelain doll with the painted face and the cotton dress that she had been given on her 3rd birthday. The only toy she had ever owned that was truly hers. It sat on the small table in the hallway, waiting as though it had known this moment was coming. Willa reached for it, and Permelia's hand shot out and snatched it away. This belongs to the Whitmore household, Permelia said. She had followed them into the hallway. Her face was still arranged in that expression of sorrowful duty, but her eyes were bright with something that looked like triumph. Whitmore property stays with the Whitmore family. Willa's face crumpled. Tears spilled down her cheeks. The sound she made was small and broken, the sound of a child learning for the first time that the world contains cruelty. Lorena knelt beside her daughter there in the hallway of the house where she had lived for 5 years, where she had worked like a servant and been treated like a curse, and she wiped the tears from Willa's face with her own calloused hands. We will make new things, Lorena said quietly. Better things, things that belong only to us. Willa nodded, though she did not understand. She was 4 years old. She did not know yet that the things people take from you matter less than the things you build for yourself. She would learn. They all would. The wagon was waiting in the yard. Nantagon. The hired driver did not speak. He had been told not to speak, and he was a man who followed instructions. His name was not important. His face was not important. He was simply the mechanism by which the Whitmore family was disposing of its unwanted property. He loaded the belongings that Lorena had been allowed to take. A trunk of clothes, a crate of tools, a sack of seeds, bedding. A cook stove that had been dented so badly it had been destined for the scrap heap anyway. He loaded these things into the wagon bed with the efficiency of a man who had performed similar tasks before and expected to perform them again. Then he helped Lorena climb onto the seat with her daughters beside her. And then he drove south. The road wound through hills covered with hardwood forest, past farms that grew smaller and poorer the farther south they traveled, past clearings where families had tried to make homes and abandoned them when the land refused to cooperate. The sky was gray, the air was cold. March in Tennessee was the cruelest month. Neither winter nor spring, the season when hope struggled to survive. Willa fell asleep against Lorena's shoulder. The rhythm of the wagon and the warmth of her mother's body and the exhaustion of crying had combined to pull her down into sleep. Her face was still streaked with tears. Her small hands were still clutched around the fabric of Lorena's dress. Hetty fussed and then quieted, her small body warm against her mother's chest. At 2 years old, she understood nothing of what had happened. She knew only that she was tired and that her mother was holding her and that these two facts together meant safety. And Lorena watched the landscape change. The hills flattened. The hardwoods gave way to cypress and tupelo. The ground grew soft, then wet, then liquid. Water appeared between the trees. Standing pools that reflected the gray sky like mirrors laid flat on the earth. The driver spoke for the first time in hours. "Your property is on the other side," he said, "about a mile south. Follow the high ground on the east bank. That is the only part that is not underwater." He helped Lorena unload her belongings. The trunk, the crate, the sack of seeds, the dented cook stove. He set them on the muddy bank of the creek and stood for a moment looking at the woman and the two small children and the pile of possessions that would not be enough to keep them alive through the summer. "Good luck," he said, and then he drove away. The sound of the wagon wheels faded slowly, the creak of wood and the clop of hooves growing fainter and fainter, until there was nothing left but the sounds of the swamp, the singing of frogs, the call of birds, the slow movement of water through channels too small to see. Lorena stood at the edge of the swamp and looked at what she had been given. 17 acres of water and mud and cypress trees rising from the water like the columns of a ruined cathedral. Spanish moss hanging from the branches and gray curtains that moved in the breeze like the hair of ghosts. The smell of decay, rich and dark. The smell of things dying and being reborn in an endless cycle that had been going on since before people came to this place. Hetty began to cry. The mosquitoes had found them, clouds of them rising from the water drawn by the warmth of human bodies by the carbon dioxide of human breath. They descended on the three figures, standing at the edge of the swamp like a plague sent by an angry god. Willa woke and looked around with wide, frightened eyes. "Mama," she said, "this is not home." Lorena looked at her daughter. She looked at the swamp. She looked at the deed in her pocket. The 17 acres that everyone said were worthless. The gift that was supposed to be her destruction. "Yes, it is," she said. "This is our home now." She picked up the first load of belongings and began walking south along the high ground on the east bank of the creek. Behind her, her daughters followed. They had no choice. Neither did she. The first night they slept in the wagon bed. Lorena had dragged as many of their possessions as she could carry to a slightly elevated spot on the ridge. She had fashioned a crude shelter from the wagon's canvas cover. She had gathered her daughters beneath it and wrapped them in every blanket she owned. And then she had lain awake and listened to the sounds of the swamp. The sounds were not what she had expected. She had expected silence. She had expected emptiness. Instead, the swamp was alive with noise. Frogs singing in choruses that rose and fell like waves on an invisible shore. Owls calling from the darkness, their voices mournful and searching. Something large moving through the water, splashing hunting. Willa pressed against her left side, Hetty against her right. Both children sleeping the deep sleep of exhaustion. Both children trusting that their mother would keep them safe. Lorena lay awake and made herself think. She thought about what she had. 17 acres. A wagon that would not last. Tools that were old and worn. Seeds that might or might not grow. Two daughters who depended on her for everything. She thought about what she needed. Shelter, food, water that was safe to drink, safety from the animals and the weather, and the 1,000 dangers that waited in a place like this. She thought about what everyone believed would happen to her, that she would fail, that she would come crawling back, that she would prove that Harlan Whitmore had been right about her all along. In the darkness, with her daughters pressed against her sides and the swamp singing its strange song all around her, Lorena made a decision. She would not fail. She would not beg. She would take these 17 acres of water and mud and cypress trees, and she would turn them into something that no one had ever imagined. And someday, she thought, someday the people who sent me here will understand what they threw away. The morning of her second day, Lorena climbed the highest point of the ridge that ran along the eastern edge of her property. The ridge was not dramatic. It rose perhaps 4 or 5 feet above the waterline, a gentle slope of clay and stone that someone unfamiliar with bottomland might have overlooked entirely. But Lorena had grown up on a small farm, and her father had taught her to read terrain the way other fathers taught their daughters to read scripture. High ground, he had told her once when she was no older than Willa was now. High ground is everything. Find the high ground first, then figure out what to do with it. She had remembered those words. She had carried them with her through 6 years of marriage, through the births of 2 daughters and the losses of 2 sons, through 5 years of being told she was worthless. Now she climbed the ridge and looked at what she had been given. From the top she could see everything. To the west the swamp spread out in a vast sheet of standing water. Cypress trees rising from it, at intervals their trunks swelling at the base into the distinctive shapes that gave them their name. Bald cypress, trees that had been standing in that water for hundreds of years. Trees that knew secrets about survival that Lorena was only beginning to learn. The water was not stagnant. She could see that now. It moved slowly, almost imperceptibly, flowing from north to south. The creek fed into the swamp at the northern end and drained out at the southern end, creating a current so gentle that it was invisible unless you watched carefully. And the swamp was not empty. Fish jumped in the channels between the cypress stands. Silver flashes that caught the morning light. Birds waited in the shallows. Herons and egrets standing motionless waiting for prey. Turtles basked on fallen logs. A kingfisher dove into the water with precision, emerging a moment later with something bright in its beak. And beyond the wildlife, Lorena saw something else. She saw the ridge, 4 acres of dry land running along the eastern edge of her property, high enough to be above the waterline even during floods, solid enough to build on. Oaks and hickories grew here, hardwood trees that preferred dry soil, trees that could be felled and shaped into lumber. And there were tulip poplars, 6 of them growing along the highest part of the ridge, massive trees over 100 feet tall, their trunks 3 feet in diameter, straight and true, reaching toward the sky like columns in a temple. Lorena knew about tulip poplars. Everyone in Tennessee knew about tulip poplars. They were the most valuable lumber trees in the state. A single tree of this size could be sold for $10 or $12. 6 trees, $60, standing right there on her property. Lorena looked at what she had been given. Harlan Whitmore had called it worthless. Permelia Whitmore had called it fitting. Like for like. But Lorena saw the ridge and the hardwood trees and the tulip poplars. She saw the water teeming with fish and the birds waiting in the shallows. She saw the cypress trees standing in the water like patient guardians. And she understood something that Harlan Whitmore had never bothered to discover. The swamp was not worthless. The swamp was a treasure. And Harlan Whitmore, in his contempt, had handed it to her for free. She found the dog on her 3rd day. She was walking the perimeter of the property, trying to understand its boundaries, trying to create a map in her mind of what belonged to her and what did not. The girls were back at the wagon sleeping. She had left them with strict instructions not to move. The whimpering came from a thicket of willow scrub near the edge of the swamp. The sound was weak, desperate. The sound of an animal that had been suffering for some time. Most people would have walked away. Most people would have assumed it was something dangerous. A raccoon, a fox, something that might bite. Lorena pushed through the willows and found a bird lying in a trap. The trap was a crude thing, a steel jaw device meant for catching raccoons. Someone had set it here and either forgotten about it or abandoned it. The dog had stepped into it sometime in the past day or 2, and the jaws had closed on its front leg, cutting deep into the flesh. The dog was a mongrel, part shepherd and part something else. Its fur was the color of old gold, matted and dirty from lying in the mud. Its ears did not match, one standing straight up and one flopping over at the tip. It looked up at Lorena with brown eyes that were frightened and surprisingly intelligent. and it did not growl or snap when she knelt beside it. Easy now, Lorena said. Her voice was soft, calm, the voice she used with her daughters when they were scared. Easy. She studied the trap. She had seen traps like this before. Her father had used them years ago before she was born. She knew how they worked. She knew how to release them. She pressed the springs on either side of the jaws. The metal was rusted and stiff. It resisted her. She pressed harder. The jaws opened. Blood flowed from the wound. The dog whimpered. Its whole body trembled with pain and fear, but it did not try to bite her. Lorena tore a strip from her petticoat and wrapped the leg. The fabric turned red almost immediately, but the pressure would help. The bleeding would slow. Then she gathered the dog in her arms and carried it back to the wagon. Willa was awake when she arrived. Her eyes went wide at the sight of the animal in her mother's arms. "Mama, what is that?" "A dog," Lorena said. "He was hurt. We are going to help him get better." She tended the wound with hot water and clean cloth. The dog lay still throughout, watching her with those intelligent brown eyes. When she was finished, it licked her hand once and closed its eyes. Hetty crawled forward and touched the dog's ear with one small finger. "Dog," Hetty said. It was one of the few words she knew. "His name is Flint," Lorena said. The name came to her without thought. It felt right. It felt like the truth. His name is Flint. Because he found us. Or because we found him. Flint stayed. Within a week, he was walking again, favoring the leg but moving. Within 2 weeks, he was following Lorena everywhere, limping along beside her as she worked. He slept at the foot of the wagon at night, one ear raised, listening for danger. He watched the girls while Lorena worked, keeping them from wandering too close to the water. He had appointed himself their guardian, and he took the job seriously. And at night, when the sounds of the swamp rose up around them, Flint would press his warm body against Lorena's side. And she would feel, for the first time since leaving the Whitmore farm, that she was not entirely alone. The old man appeared on her 5th day. Lorena was dragging a fallen oak branch toward the ridge when she heard movement in the brush behind her. She spun around, her hand going to the hatchet at her belt, and found herself facing a figure that seemed to have materialized from the swamp itself. He was old, perhaps 70 or more. His face was weathered and lined like leather that had been left out in the sun for too many years. His beard had once been red and was now the color of iron rust streaked with white. His clothes were patched in so many places that it was impossible to tell what the original fabric had looked like. His boots were held together with rawhide. He carried a rifle that looked older than he was, its stock worn smooth by decades of handling. But his eyes were sharp, clear blue and piercing. The eyes of a man who had survived things that would have killed most people. "You are the one they sent here," he said. His voice was rough from disuse. The voice of a man who spent most of his time alone. The one with the daughters. Lorena kept her hand on the hatchet. "I am." The old man nodded slowly. He looked past her at the wagon, at the small figures of Willa and Hetty visible in the distance, at the dog that was already on its feet watching him with hackles raised. "I am Ezra Cobb," he said. "People call me Ezra, though there are not many people left who call me anything. I have lived on the edge of this swamp for 40 years. Lorena waited. "I saw you arrive," Ezra continued. "Watched you from the trees. Wanted to see what kind of woman they had sent this time." This time Ezra spat into the brush. "There have been others, men mostly, come to claim the land, drain the swamp, make something of it." He paused. "They lasted a season, maybe 2. Then they left or they died." The words hung in the air between them. Lorena felt a chill that had nothing to do with the March wind. "But you," Ezra said. His blue eyes studied her. "You are different. I can see it." "How can you see it?" "Because you have been here 5 days and you have not tried to fight the swamp. You have been watching it, learning it. That is what the smart ones do." He reached into his coat and pulled out something that he tossed to Lorena. She caught it reflexively. It was a fish, freshly caught, cleaned and ready for cooking. "The swamp is not your enemy," Ezra said. "The swamp is a vault that fools do not know how to open. But I think you might figure out the combination." He turned to go, then paused. "If you need help, my cabin is a mile north along the creek. The dog knows the way. He used to be mine, before he wandered off and got himself caught in that trap." Lorena looked down at Flint. The dog was watching Ezra with an expression that might have been recognition. His hackles had lowered. His tail gave a single tentative wag. "Why would you help me?" Ezra was silent for a moment. Then he said, "Because I have watched a lot of people come to this swamp thinking they knew better than it, and I have watched all of them lose. But you look like someone who knows how to listen, and listeners are rare." He walked away into the trees, and within seconds he had vanished, swallowed by the swamp as completely as if he had never been there at all. Lorena stood holding the fish, watching the space where he had been. The swamp was silent around her. Even the birds had stopped singing. Then she looked at Flint. "Well," she said, "I suppose we have a neighbor." That night they ate fish. Lorena cooked it over a fire she had built from fallen branches. The smoke rose into the darkening sky. The flames cast dancing shadows on the canvas of their makeshift shelter. Willa ate with her fingers, juice running down her chin. Her eyes were bright in the firelight. For the first time since they had arrived, she looked something other than frightened. "This is good, Mama," she said. "Can we have more tomorrow?" Lorena said. "Tomorrow we will catch our own." Hetty had already fallen asleep, her small body curled against Lorena's side. Flint lay at the edge of the firelight, his head resting on his paws, his eyes half closed. And Lorena sat and looked out at the swamp. The water was silver in the moonlight. The cypress trees stood like sentinels, their branches reaching toward the stars. The frogs had begun their nightly chorus. The owls were calling. It was beautiful. She had not expected that. She had expected horror. She had expected desolation. She had expected to look at this place and see nothing but the contempt of the people who had sent her here. Instead, she saw beauty. She saw the moon reflected in still water. She saw fireflies beginning to rise from the grass. She saw the dark shapes of birds settling into the trees for the night. And she understood something. Harlan Whitmore had given her this place to destroy her. He had expected her to see what he saw: worthlessness, despair, a slow death by inches. But Lorena did not see what Harlan saw. She saw possibility. She saw a ridge that could hold a cabin. She saw trees that could become lumber. She saw water that teemed with fish. She saw land that no one else wanted, which meant land that no one else would try to take from her. She saw a future. Willa had fallen asleep against her other side. 2 daughters, 2 small bodies breathing softly in the darkness. 2 lives that depended entirely on her. Lorena looked up at the stars. She had been given a curse. She would turn it into a blessing. The next morning, she began to build. She started with a survey of the ridge, walking every foot of it, noting which trees were healthy and which were dying, identifying the spots where the ground was firmest, looking for natural drainage patterns that would tell her where water would flow during heavy rains. Her father had taught her this, those long-ago lessons on the small farm where she had grown up. "Read the land," he had said. "The land will tell you everything you need to know. You just have to listen." She listened. The ridge told her that the highest point was near the southern end, perhaps 5.5 feet above the waterline. This was where she would build, high enough to survive any flood, solid enough to support a structure. The trees told her that the oaks on the eastern slope were the healthiest. Their trunks were straight. Their wood would be strong. She would fell them first. The water told her that it flowed from north to south, that there were channels between the cypress stands where the current was stronger. These channels would be where the fish congregated. These channels would feed her family. She worked from dawn to dusk, felling trees with the cracked-handled axe that had been destined for the scrap heap, dragging logs to the building site, notching them with careful, precise cuts. Willa helped where she could, carrying smaller branches, gathering kindling, watching Hetty while Lorena worked. She was 4 years old. She should have been playing with dolls, learning her letters, being a child. Instead, she was learning to survive. Mama Willa asked one evening as they sat by the fire, "Why did Grandfather send us away?" Lorena was quiet for a long moment. "Because he could not see our value," she finally said. "Because he looked at us and saw something he did not want. But just because someone cannot see your value does not mean you have no value. It only means they are blind." Willa considered this. Then she said, "I think Grandfather is very blind." "I think so too," Lorena said. And for the first time since they had arrived, she smiled. Ezra came on the 8th day. He appeared at the edge of the clearing where Lorena was working. He watched her for a long time before he spoke. Watched her swing the axe. Watched her notch the logs. Watched the way she moved efficient and purposeful. "You know what you are doing," he said finally. "Lorena did not stop working. My father taught me. Good man. He died when I was 12, but I remember what he taught me. Ezra nodded. The good ones, he said. The good ones stay with you. He picked up a log that Lorena had been struggling to move, carried it to where she was building as though it weighed nothing. I am not here to help, he said before she could speak. I am here to show. You have to do the work yourself, but I can show you where the mistakes are before you make them. Lorena looked at him, his weathered face, his sharp blue eyes, his hands scarred and calloused from 40 years of living alone in the swamp. Why, she asked again. Why do you care? Ezra was silent for a moment. Because I was thrown away too, he said finally, a long time ago by people who could not see my value. He looked at her. And I survived. And I want to see if you can survive too. He stayed for 2 hours, showed her how to fit the logs together more tightly, showed her where to find the best clay for chinking, showed her the trick of using leverage instead of strength to move heavy objects. Then he left, vanishing into the swamp as silently as he had come. But he came back every few days, sometimes with fish, sometimes with knowledge, always watching her work, always pointing out mistakes before she made them. He never did the work for her. He was clear about that from the beginning. This is your life, he said. You have to build it yourself. I am just here to make sure you do not die in the process. The cabin took 7 weeks. Lorena worked from dawn to dusk every day, with breaks only to feed her daughters and tend to their needs. She felled oaks on the ridge using the axe with the cracked handle that she had wrapped with rawhide to make it hold. She notched each log by hand. She rolled them into position using a leverage system of poles and rope that her father had taught her when she was 12 years old. Her hands bled. Her back ached. Her muscles screamed for rest that she could not give them. But slowly, the structure rose. Ezra came to help with the heavy work. He did not ask permission, and Lorena did not offer thanks. He simply appeared when the work was difficult and disappeared when it was done. Between them in the span of those 7 weeks, they raised a structure that would last for generations. The cabin was 14 feet wide and 18 feet deep, a single room on the ground floor and a loft for sleeping. The logs were oak solid and heavy, fitted together so tightly that a knife blade could not pass between them. The chinks were filled with clay mixed with Spanish moss. The hearth was river rock gathered from the creek. The floor was packed, earth hardened with a wash of clay that dried to a smooth, dark surface. The roof was cypress bark layered so thickly that not a drop of rain would penetrate, and the cabin faced west. Lorena chose the orientation deliberately. The front door and the single window looked out over the swamp. Every evening when the sun went down, the light poured through that window and filled the cabin with gold. Willa asked her why. Because Lorena said, I want you to see the sunset every night. I want you to see something beautiful every single day. The night they moved in, all 3 of them lay together on the packed earth floor, blankets beneath them, flint curled at their feet, the fire crackling in the hearth. Mama Willa whispered, "This house is smaller than grandmother's house." "Yes, but nobody yells here." Lorena pulled her daughter closer. "No," she said, "nobody yells here." Willa was quiet for a moment. "I like it better," she said finally. "I like it much better." That was the moment Willa began to understand what home really meant. Outside, the swamp sang its nightly song, the frogs and the owls and the wind in the cypress trees, the sound of water moving slowly through channels, the sound of a world that had existed for thousands of years before humans came and would exist for thousands of years after they were gone. Inside, Lorena lay awake and listened. She had been given 17 acres of swamp. She had built a cabin on the ridge. She had her daughters and a neighbor who came and went like a ghost, and she had survived. 7 weeks in a place that was supposed to destroy her. 7 weeks of work that should have been impossible. 7 weeks of refusing to give up. She had survived, and she was just getting started. Tomorrow she would begin work on the raised beds, the techniques she remembered from a book she had read in stolen moments in the Whitmore Library. A book about farming in flooded lands, about building platforms of soil above the waterline. Tomorrow she would start to make this place truly hers. But tonight she lay with her daughters pressed against her sides, with the fire warming the cabin, with the swamp singing outside. Tonight she allowed herself to feel something she had not felt in a very long time. Hope. 17 acres of swamp, Harlan Whitmore had said. Like for like, Permelia, Whitmore had added. They had given her this place to punish her, to break her, to prove that she was as worthless as they believed. But Lorena was not broken. Lorena was building. And someday she thought as sleep finally began to claim her. Someday the people who sent me here will understand what they threw away. They had given her a curse. She was turning it into a blessing. The raised beds were an experiment born of desperation and memory. Lorena had found the book in the library of the Whitmore farmhouse during her second year of marriage. A thin volume with a cracked spine and pages yellowed by age. It had been shoved between larger books, forgotten, gathering dust on a shelf that Permelia never bothered to inspect. The book was about agricultural techniques from around the world, written by a man who had traveled to places Lorena could barely imagine. China, the Nile Delta, the floating gardens of Mexico. She had read it in stolen moments, hiding it beneath her apron when Permelia walked past, reading by candlelight when the house was asleep, memorizing passages that seemed like they might someday matter. One chapter had stayed with her. It described a method of farming used in flooded river valleys. Instead of draining the water, farmers built raised platforms of soil above the waterline, creating islands of dry earth surrounded by shallow water. The plants grew on the platforms. The water provided constant moisture from below, and the standing water around the beds prevented insects from reaching the crops. Lorena had remembered the technique. Now she would find out if it worked. She built the first beds in May when the spring rains had finally stopped and the water level in the swamp had stabilized. She constructed frames of split oak logs, each frame 3 feet wide and 12 feet long. She filled them with a mixture of swamp muck and ridge clay, layering the materials the way the book had described. The swamp muck was black and rich, 1,000 years of leaves falling into the water and decomposing, 1,000 years of nutrients accumulating in the mud. It smelled of decay, but Lorena knew that decay was just another word for transformation. Death becoming life, the old becoming new. She raised the beds 18 inches above the waterline, high enough to keep the roots from drowning, low enough that the water could wick upward through the soil. Then she planted tomatoes in the first bed, squash in the second, peppers and beans in the third, and then she waited. The results came faster than she had dared to hope. By late June, the tomato plants were 3 feet tall. Their leaves were dark green and glossy. Their stems were thick and strong, and they were heavy with fruit. The tomatoes themselves were unlike anything Lorena had seen before. The size of her fist, dark red, almost burgundy. Their skin was tight and smooth. When she picked the first one and bit into it, the flesh was dense and sweet with a richness that made her close her eyes. She brought one to Ezra. The old man sat on a fallen log at the edge of the swamp, his rifle across his knees. He had been watching the water the way he often did, looking for things that Lorena could not see. He took the tomato from her hand and studied it, turned it over, smelled it. Then he bit into it. Juice ran down his beard. His eyebrows rose. That, he said, is the best tomato I have eaten in 40 years. It is the soil, Lorena said. 1,000 years of leaves falling into the water and rotting. All that richness just waiting for someone to use it. Ezra looked at her with those sharp blue eyes. You figured out the combination. I am beginning to. By the end of summer, she had 20 raised beds producing more vegetables than she could possibly eat. The standing water around the beds kept the soil moist without drowning the roots. The constant moisture meant she never had to carry water from the creek. The beds watered themselves. And the insects could not reach the plants. The water surrounding each bed acted as a moat. Beetles and cutworms and all the crawling things that destroyed crops on dry land could not cross the water to reach her vegetables. She had created a system, a way of working with the swamp instead of against it. And the fish were everywhere, swimming in the channels between the cypress stands, jumping in the shallows near the raised beds, silver and gold, and sometimes the dark shadow of something larger moving through the depths. Lorena built weirs in the channels, V-shaped fences of woven cane that funneled fish into narrow enclosures. The technique was old. Her father had shown her pictures of similar structures in a book about Native American fishing methods. Each trap produced 3 to 5 pounds of fish per day. She taught herself to smoke the fish over hickory wood, building a small smokehouse from cypress bark and clay. The smoked fish would keep for months. Protein stored against the winter. Food that would not spoil. And the crawfish. The crawfish burrowed in the mud throughout the swamp. Thousands of them, tens of thousands. They came out at night, their claws raised, their antennae waving. They were everywhere, a food source so abundant that Lorena could not understand why the bottomland was considered worthless. Then she realized. The local farmers did not eat crawfish. Crawfish were poor food, swamp food, the food of people who had nothing better. Respectable people, they ate beef and pork and chicken. Respectable people turned up their noses at anything that crawled in the mud. Lorena did not share this prejudice. She ate the crawfish. She ate the fish. She ate the vegetables from her raised beds. She ate better than she had eaten in 5 years at the Whitmore farm. And she began to sell. The first time Lorena brought her produce to the market in Millbrook, people stared. She arrived in the wagon with Flint walking beside her, Willa sitting on the seat with Hetty in her lap. The wagon was loaded with baskets of tomatoes and squash buckets of live crawfish and bundles of smoked fish wrapped in cheesecloth. People stared because they knew who she was. The woman thrown out by the Whitmore family. The woman given 17 acres of swamp. The woman everyone expected to fail. Word had spread through the county in the months since her arrival. The gossip had made its rounds through church socials and general stores and the front porches of farmhouses where women gathered to talk. Everyone knew the story, everyone had their opinion, and everyone expected her to come crawling back. Instead, she came to market with a wagon full of produce. Gideon Blackwell was the first to approach. Blackwell was the richest man in the county, owner of 200 acres of prime farmland. A man with a white beard and a black suit and the kind of confidence that came from never having been told no. He walked over to Lorena's wagon and looked at her tomatoes with an expression of disbelief. "Where did you get these? I grew them," Lorena replied. "Where on my property?" "The swamp on Willow Creek." Blackwell laughed. It was not a kind sound. Swamps do not produce tomatoes. Swamps produce mosquitoes and fever and failure. Lorena held up one of the tomatoes, dark red and perfect in the morning light. "Then what is this?" Blackwell did not have an answer. His mouth opened and closed. His face flushed red. Then he turned and walked away. Lorena heard him say to someone as he left, she must have stolen them. "That land cannot grow anything." Dr. Ambrose Whitfield came next. He was the town doctor, a man with a degree from Nashville and a practice that served the wealthy families of Perry County. He wore spectacles and a vest with a gold watch chain. He believed that science had the answer to everything. "The pH of swamp soil is far too acidic for vegetable cultivation," he announced. He did not introduce himself. He did not ask permission to speak. He simply began lecturing as though Lorena were a student who needed correction. "These plants cannot possibly be healthy. By winter, everything you have grown will be worthless." Lorena pointed to the tomatoes on her wagon. "Does that look worthless to you?" "I do not trust appearances," Whitfield said. His nose wrinkled as though he had smelled something unpleasant. "I trust data." He left convinced of his own rightness, convinced that reality would eventually align with his theories. Reverend Josiah Tatum came to offer spiritual counsel. He was a thin man with a thin voice and thin ideas about what God wanted from his creation. He wore black and carried a Bible and looked at Lorena with the kind of pity that was indistinguishable from contempt. "My child," he said, "God gave mankind the high ground for a reason. The swamps are the territories of darkness. By choosing to live there, you are placing yourself outside of God's design." Lorena looked at him. "Do you see the herons standing in the water?" Tatum glanced toward the swamp visible in the distance beyond the edge of town. "I see them," he said. "Did God make them?" "Of course. Then perhaps God's design is larger than you imagined." Tatum left muttering about theological pride in women. Opal Kincaid came to the market the following week, not to buy, but to observe. She was the wife of the general store owner, a woman whose tongue was sharper than any blade in her husband's inventory. She walked past Lorena's wagon, slowly looking at the tomatoes, looking at the smoked fish, looking at the woman who had been cast out. "Poor thing," Opal said, loudly enough for everyone to hear, "living in that swamp with 2 small children. I give her until Christmas before she comes crawling back to civilization." She did not buy anything. She simply walked away, leaving her words behind like seeds planted in fertile soil. The gossip spread. Within a week, everyone in Millbrook knew that Opal Kincaid had predicted Lorena's failure. Within 2 weeks, people were making bets. Luther Doss was the first to put money on it. He was 22 years old, the son of the town blacksmith, a young man with more confidence than sense. He stood in front of the general store and announced that he was betting $5 that Lorena Whitmore would sell her land before autumn. $5, he said, easy money. No woman survives alone in a swamp. He would remember those words for the rest of his life. But not everyone was hostile. A woman approached the wagon on Lorena's second day at market, a woman with dark skin and careful eyes. She moved through the crowd with the wariness of someone who was accustomed to being watched, who was accustomed to being judged. Her name was Opaline Hale. She was a widow who sold herbs and medicines at the market, remedies passed down from her grandmother and her grandmother's grandmother, teas and poultices and tinctures that the respectable doctors dismissed as superstition. She was treated by most of the town's people with the same dismissive contempt they showed to Lorena. These tomatoes, Opaline said. Her voice was low, private. A conversation meant for two people and no one else. Where did you really grow them? The swamp on Willow Creek. Raised beds built above the waterline. Opaline's eyes widened. I have heard of such methods. Old methods. From the old country. The swamp soil is rich, Lorena said. The water keeps the pests away. Opaline bought 3 tomatoes. She came back the next week and bought more. And she brought something else. Knowledge. Opaline knew herbs. She knew which plants healed and which ones harmed. She knew remedies for fever and cough and the deep ache of joints that had worked too long. And she was willing to share that knowledge with a woman who, like herself, had been cast out. A friendship formed between them. It was not the kind of friendship that announced itself. It was quiet, practical, built on shared glances and small kindnesses, and the understanding that both of them were fighting the same battle. They were both women who had been told they had no value. They were both proving the world wrong. Virgil Pruitt appeared in September. Lorena was working in the raised beds when she heard footsteps on the ridge behind her. She straightened and turned her hand, instinctively moving toward the hatchet at her belt. The man standing at the edge of her property was not Ezra. He was 35 years old, with the kind of face that might have been handsome if there had been any warmth in it. His hair was dark and oiled. His clothes were clean and pressed. He wore a smile that did not reach his eyes. Mrs. Whitmore, he said. His voice was smooth, pleasant, the voice of a man who had practiced being charming. I hope I am not disturbing you. Who are you, Virgil Pruitt? He removed his hat and held it against his chest, a gesture of respect that somehow felt mocking. My family owns the property that borders the Whitmore holdings. I have heard a great deal about what you have accomplished here. Lorena said nothing. She watched him the way Flint watched strangers, with wariness, with suspicion. Pruitt looked around at the raised beds, at the cabin on the ridge, at the smokehouse and the fish traps and all the evidence of work that should have been impossible. You have done something remarkable, he said. A woman alone, 2 small children, building all of this from nothing. He shook his head in apparent admiration. Truly remarkable. Lorena still said nothing. I have come, Pruitt continued, to make you an offer. This land, this swamp, it cannot be easy living here. The isolation, the danger, he paused. I would like to purchase it from you. $15 for the entire property, land and timber and everything on it. Lorena looked at him. She thought about the 6 tulip poplars standing on the ridge, each one worth $10 or $12, $60 to $70 in timber alone, standing right there on her property. The timber alone is worth more than that. Pruitt's smile did not waver, but something cold entered his eyes, something that had been hidden behind the charm. You are a woman alone, he said. His voice was still pleasant, but the pleasantness had an edge to it now. This land is dangerous. Accidents happen. He paused. It would be a shame if something were to happen to you or your daughters. Flint had been lying in the shade near the cabin. Now he stood up. His hackles rose. A low growl rumbled in his throat. My dog does not like you, Lorena said. I trust my dog. Pruitt looked at Flint. The dog's teeth were visible now. His growl had deepened into something that sounded like a warning. You will regret this, Pruitt said. He turned and walked away. His footsteps faded into the forest. The sound of his departure was swallowed by the swamp. Lorena stood for a long time after he was gone. Her hand was still on her hatchet. Her heart was still beating fast. Flint came to stand beside her, his hackles slowly lowered. But his eyes stayed fixed on the direction Pruitt had gone. 2 weeks later, 3 of Lorena's raised beds were destroyed in the night. She found them in the morning. The frames had been kicked apart, the plants trampled. Vegetables that had been nearly ready for harvest were scattered in the mud, crushed and ruined. She stood looking at the destruction for a long time. Then she rebuilt them. A week after that, her fish traps were cut. The woven cane sliced through with a knife. The fish escaped. A week's worth of food gone. She rebuilt those too. She went to Ezra's cabin that evening. Found the old man sitting on his porch watching the stars come out. "I need a gun," she said. Ezra did not ask why. He simply went inside and came back with a shotgun. It was old but well maintained. The stock was worn smooth from years of handling. "You know how to use it. My father taught me." Ezra nodded. He handed her a box of shells. "Make sure Pruitt knows you have it," he said. "Men like him are cowards. They only attack when they think their victim cannot fight back." Lorena took the gun home. She practiced with it until she could load and fire without thinking. She kept it by the door of the cabin where anyone approaching could see it, and she made sure that Virgil Pruitt knew she had it. The sabotage stopped, but Lorena did not forget. She knew that Pruitt was still out there, still watching, still waiting for an opportunity. She would be ready when it came. The storm came in November. It began with a darkening of the sky in the southwest, a greenish tint to the clouds that Lorena had learned to recognize, a stillness in the air that made the birds stop singing and the fish stop jumping. Ezra had taught her to read these signs. Storm coming, he had said months ago when a similar darkness had gathered on the horizon. Big one. When the sky turns that color and the animals go quiet, you have maybe 6 hours. Use them wisely. She used them. She gathered Willa and Hetty and Flint into the cabin. She closed the shutters. She filled every container she owned with fresh water from the creek. She brought firewood inside enough to last a week. And then she waited. The first night was loud. Wind that screamed through the cypress trees, tearing branches loose and sending them crashing into the water. Rain that fell in sheets so thick that Lorena could not see the edge of the porch from the window. The cabin shook with each gust. The shutters rattled. The fire in the hearth flickered and danced. Willa and Hetty huddled together on the bed in the loft. Flint lay at the foot of the ladder, his ears flat against his head, his eyes tracking every sound. Lorena sat by the fire and listened to the storm try to tear her world apart. The second night was worse. The wind strengthened. It came in gusts that felt like blows slamming against the cabin walls with enough force to make the logs creak. A corner of the roof lifted just slightly and water poured in. Cold water driven by the wind soaking the bedding, soaking the children. Lorena worked through the night with rags and buckets, trying to contain the flood, trying to keep her daughters dry, trying to hold everything together through sheer force of will. Willa helped as much as a 4-year-old could, carrying rags, holding buckets, her small face set with determination that broke Lorena's heart. Hetty cried, then stopped crying, then simply sat silent and still watching her mother work. By dawn of the third day, Hetty had stopped doing anything at all. Lorena noticed it first as an absence. The 2-year-old was usually in motion, crawling, climbing, reaching for things. Even in the midst of the storm, she should have been moving, but she was not moving. She lay on the bed in the loft, her small body still except for the rapid rise and fall of her chest. Her eyes were open but glazed. When Lorena touched her forehead, the heat that radiated from the child's skin made her gasp. Fever. High fever, the kind that killed children, the kind that left them damaged even if they survived. Lorena felt her heart stop. Not this, she thought. Not my daughter. Not here. There was no doctor. The nearest one was 6 miles away through flooded roads. Even if the roads had been passable, even if she could have made the journey, Dr. Whitfield would not come to the swamp for a woman he had dismissed as a fool. But Opaline was only 2 miles away. Opaline knew remedies. Opaline had saved lives that the doctors had given up on. 2 miles through a flooded swamp in the middle of a storm. Lorena did not hesitate. She bundled Hetty in every blanket she could find. She gave Willa strict instructions to stay inside with Flint. She kissed her older daughter's forehead and told her that everything would be all right. Then she stepped out into the storm. The world had become water. The path to Opaline's cabin was submerged to knee depth in most places, waist depth in others. The current was strong, fed by 3 days of rain, pulling at Lorena's legs with every step. She pushed forward. She held Hetty against her chest, protecting the child's face from the rain with her own body. The water was cold. The wind was colder. Every step was a battle. Every breath was a struggle. 1 mile. The rain drove into her face like needles. The wind tried to tear her daughter from her arms. The water rose higher, reaching her waist, her chest. She lifted Hetty above her head, holding the child in the air, wading forward through water that threatened to sweep her off her feet. 2 miles. She could see Opaline's cabin through the rain, a dark shape against the gray sky. Smoke rising from the chimney, whipped away instantly by the wind. She stumbled up the path, fell, rose, stumbled again. The door opened before she reached it. Opaline was waiting. She had seen Lorena coming somehow through the sheets of rain. She stood in the doorway, her arms open, her face grim with understanding. And when Lorena stumbled inside with Hetty in her arms, Opaline did not ask questions. She simply took the child and laid her by the fire and began to work. Elderberry syrup measured carefully into the child's slack mouth. Willow bark tea brewed strong and bitter. A poultice of herbs that Lorena did not recognize applied to Hetty's chest and wrapped with clean cloth. They worked through the night, through the 4th day, through the 5th. The storm raged outside, the wind howled, the rain fell. But inside Opaline's cabin there was only the crackle of the fire and the soft sound of 2 women fighting for a child's life. On the morning of the 6th day, Hetty opened her eyes. "Mama," she said. Her voice was weak but clear. "Flint licked my face." Flint was not there. Flint was still at the cabin with Willa 2 miles away through the flooded swamp. But Lorena did not correct her. She simply gathered her daughter in her arms and wept. The storm passed. Lorena returned to find Ezra already repairing the roof. He had walked through the flood when the storm ended, found Willa alone with Flint, understood what had happened. He did not speak. He simply continued working, replacing the corner of the roof that had lifted, reinforcing the walls where the wind had loosened the chinking, moving with the efficiency of a man who had survived many storms and would survive many more. Willa ran to her mother when Lorena appeared, threw her arms around Lorena's legs, buried her face in her mother's dress. "Is Hetty all right?" she asked. Her voice was small, frightened. "I was so scared, Mama." "Hetty is fine," Lorena said. She knelt and gathered both her daughters in her arms. "We are all fine. We survived." By nightfall, the roof was repaired. By the following week, the damaged beds had been rebuilt. The fish traps had been replaced. Life continued. But something had changed in Lorena. The storm had tested her. It had nearly taken her daughter. It had shown her how fragile everything was, how quickly the things she had built could be destroyed. And it had shown her something else. She was not alone. Opaline had come when needed. Ezra had come when needed. People who owed her nothing had chosen to help anyway. This was different from the Whitmore family. This was not obligation or duty or the cold calculation of what someone might be worth. This was real. The second year was better. Lorena expanded to 35 raised beds. She built a proper smokehouse larger than the first with racks that could hold 50 pounds of fish at a time. She dug a root cellar into the side of the ridge, a cool, dark space where vegetables could be stored for months. She acquired ducks, 18 Muscovy ducks that lived on the swamp, paddling through the channels, eating insects and snails, and whatever else they could find. They produced eggs and meat without requiring a single grain of feed. Hetty named them all: Duchess, Lady, Countess, Baroness, names that a 5-year-old thought sounded important, names that made Lorena smile. Willa learned to help with the fish traps. At 7 years old, she could paddle the flat-bottomed boat that Lorena had built. She could count the catch. She could identify which fish were worth keeping and which should be thrown back. She was becoming capable, self-reliant, the kind of girl who would grow into a woman who could survive anything. Flint grew older and calmer. His muzzle was beginning to show gray. His step was not as quick as it had once been, but he still slept on the porch during the day watching for strangers, still slept at the foot of the girls' bed at night, guarding them even in his dreams. And Lorena sold. And Lorena, every week at the market, more produce than she could carry, more fish than she could smoke. People who had laughed at her the first year now waited for her to arrive. People who had called her land worthless now asked how she did it. She did not tell them. Not because she wanted to keep her methods secret, but because she knew they would not believe her. They would hear raised beds and swamp muck and fish traps, and they would shake their heads and walk away. They would assume she was lying, or crazy, or both. So she let them wonder. The third year was better still. She built an addition to the cabin, a second room where the girls could sleep apart from her, privacy that children needed as they grew older, space that made the cabin feel less like a shelter and more like a home. She sold 2 of the tulip poplars for $16, kept the other 4. A standing tree was a savings account. A cut tree was cash that spent in a day. She would cut the others when she needed them. Until then, they would stand on the ridge like patient guardians growing taller and more valuable with each passing year. Emmett Yancey appeared in the third year. He was 17 years old, the son of a hired man who worked for the Whitmore family. He had red hair and freckles and hands that were already calloused from years of farm work. He came to the swamp in secret, walking the 6 miles from the Whitmore farm on a Sunday afternoon when he was supposed to be resting. "Mrs. Whitmore," he said. He stood at the edge of the ridge, his hat in his hands, his face nervous but determined. "I want to know how you made those raised beds work." Lorena studied him. She had seen him before at the market, watching her from a distance, watching her the way someone watches a teacher. "Why? Because what you are doing matters," Emmett said, "and what they are doing at the Whitmore farm does not." Lorena looked at this young man who had walked 6 miles to ask questions no one else had thought to ask. "Come back tomorrow," she said, "before dawn. I will show you." Emmett returned before dawn. He found Lorena already at the raised beds, her hands moving with the efficiency of long practice. Her attention focused on the plants, on the soil, on the water that surrounded the beds like a protective moat. "Show me," he said. "Show me everything." So she did. She taught him how to read the water level, how to know when the beds needed more muck, how to identify the channels where fish congregated. She taught him the difference between cypress and tupelo, between crawfish burrows and muskrat dens. Emmett learned quickly. He had the hunger of someone who had been starving for knowledge without knowing it. He asked questions constantly, wrote notes in a small book he carried in his pocket, came back week after week learning more each time. "Why are you teaching me?" he asked one afternoon. They were standing at the edge of the swamp watching a heronfish in the shallows. "I am nobody. I am the son of a hired man." Lorena looked at him. "Because I was nobody too," she said, "and someone taught me." She thought of Ezra, of the fish he had thrown to her on her 5th day, of the knowledge he had shared without being asked. "Knowledge that is hoarded dies," she said. "Knowledge that is shared lives forever." Emmett nodded. He understood. Years later, when he had his own farm and his own students, he would say the same thing to them. He would pass on what Lorena had taught him, and they would pass it on to others, and the knowledge would continue spreading outward like ripples from a stone dropped in still water. But that was later. Now Emmett was just a 17-year-old boy with dirt under his fingernails and questions in his eyes. And Lorena was just a woman who had been thrown away by people who did not understand her value, teaching each other, learning from each other, building something that would outlast them both. The lawsuit came in September of the 3rd year. Lorena was working in the raised beds when she heard the sound of horses, multiple horses, coming down the track that led to her property. She straightened, wiped her hands on her apron, walked to the edge of the ridge. 3 men were climbing down from horses at the base of the slope. She recognized 2 of them immediately. Harlan Whitmore, older now, gaunt. The drought of the previous summer had aged him. His face was lined. His clothes hung loose on a frame that had once been robust. Virgil Pruitt, still smooth, still charming. Still with that smile that did not reach his eyes. The third man was a stranger, a lawyer judging by his suit and the leather satchel he carried. From Nashville, judging by the quality of his boots. They climbed the ridge, Pruitt in front, Harlan behind, the lawyer bringing up the rear, his shoes slipping on the muddy slope. Lorena waited for them at the top. Flint was at her side. His hackles were raised. His growl was low and constant. And standing beside her was a young man she had met only 2 weeks ago. Harrison Ford, 24 years old, a lawyer from the county seat, a man who had heard about what Lorena had built and offered his services before she even knew she needed them. That land belongs to the Whitmore family, Harlan said. His voice was not as strong as it had once been. The drought had taken something from him, something he would never get back. The deed was signed under duress. Lorena held up the deed, the same document Harlan had given her 3 years ago, the same signatures at the bottom. This document bears your signature, she said. It bears the signatures of 2 witnesses. It was registered with the county clerk. You were forced to take it, Harlan said. I was given a choice between taking this land and leaving with nothing. I chose to take the land. That is not duress, the lawyers argued. They produced documents. They cited precedents. They spoke in the language of law, which is the language of power dressed in the clothes of justice. But Lorena was not listening to the lawyers. She was watching Harlan. She saw the desperation in his eyes, the fear, the knowledge that everything he had built was crumbling around him. She understood what this lawsuit was really about. It was not about the land. It was about pride. Harlan Whitmore had given away 17 acres of swamp to humiliate a woman. He had expected her to fail. Instead, she had succeeded while his own farm crumbled, and he could not stand it. Lorena stepped forward. Mr. Whitmore, she said quietly. Her voice was calm, steady, the voice of a woman who had nothing left to fear. You gave me this land because you thought it was worthless. You wanted me to fail. I gave you a generous gift, Harlan said, but his voice wavered. You gave me a curse, but I turned it into a blessing. And now you cannot forgive me for proving you wrong. She held up the deed. This land is mine, legally, morally, and in every way that matters. You signed it over. You cannot take it back. Harlan stared at her. For a long moment, no one spoke. The swamp was silent around them. Even the birds had stopped singing. Then, without a word, Harlan turned and climbed back down the ridge, mounted his horse, rode away without looking back. Virgil Pruitt lingered for a moment. His smile was gone now. His face was hard and cold. This is not over, he said. Yes, it is, Lorena replied. He left. The lawyer followed. The sound of hoofbeats faded into the distance. Lorena stood on the ridge and watched them go. She had won, for now. The drought began in April of 1888. At first, it seemed like nothing unusual. A dry spell, a late start to the spring rains, the kind of thing that happened every few years and resolved itself within a few weeks. But the weeks passed, and the rain did not come. May arrived, the skies stayed clear, the sun beat down on the land with an intensity that felt personal. Punishing. June. The wells across Perry County began to drop. Water that had always been there reliable as the sunrise began to disappear. Farmers who had never thought about water began to think about nothing else. July. The wells ran dry. The crops died. Tobacco withered in the fields, the leaves turning brown and brittle, crumbling to dust at a touch. Corn yellowed and collapsed, the stalks falling over like exhausted soldiers. Gardens produced nothing. The vegetables that families depended on simply stopped growing. Livestock suffered. Cattle with no water to drink. Horses too weak to work. Chickens dying in their coops. Their feathers matted, their eyes glazed. The county had not seen a drought this severe in 35 years. But the swamp did not dry. The water level dropped 12 inches. Lorena watched it happen with a mixture of concern and wonder. The edges of the swamp receded. Mud that had been underwater for years was suddenly exposed to the sun. But the water held, fed by Willow Creek, fed by the groundwater that seeped into the bottomland from sources deep beneath the earth, fed by the accumulated moisture of 1,000 years of rainfall soaking into the soil. The swamp refused to die. The raised beds stayed moist. The constant seepage from below continued to water the plants even as farms across the county turned to dust. The vegetables kept growing, green and lush and impossibly healthy. The fish traps kept filling. The fish had nowhere else to go. As the water receded, they concentrated in the remaining channels. Lorena caught more fish than ever before, and she kept selling. She was the only farmer at the market with fresh vegetables, the only one with produce that was not wilted or stunted or dying. People who had laughed at her were now coming to buy from her. People who had called her land worthless were now asking how she did it. In August, they started coming to the swamp itself. Farmers with empty wagons and dry wells, families with children whose lips were cracked from thirst. They came to the edge of Lorena's property and asked humbly if they could fill their barrels from Willow Creek. She gave them water. She gave them vegetables. She gave them fish. She did not ask for anything in return because the swamp had taught her that abundance is not diminished by sharing, that giving does not make you poorer, that the more you share, the more you have. The drought continued through September, through October. The land baked under a sun that showed no mercy. Farms that had been in families for generations began to fail. Debts came due, banks foreclosed, families loaded their belongings into wagons and headed west looking for land that might still sustain them. And through it all, the swamp endured. Lorena stood on the ridge one evening in late October and watched the sun set over the water. The light was golden. The air was still. The swamp was singing its evening song, the frogs and the birds and the insects that had survived the drought because they had water. She thought about Harlan Whitmore. She had heard rumors. The Whitmore farm was struggling. The tobacco crop had failed. The wells had run dry. The debts were mounting. The family that had cast her out was now facing the same destruction they had wished upon her. But Lorena did not feel satisfaction. She did not feel triumph. She felt only a strange, quiet sadness for people who had never learned to see the value in what they had, who had spent their lives chasing things that did not matter, who had thrown away a treasure because they did not recognize it for what it was. She thought about her daughters, Willa and Hetty asleep in the cabin behind her, growing stronger every day, learning to survive, learning to thrive. She thought about what she had built, the raised beds, the smokehouse, the root cellar, the cabin that faced west so they could watch the sunset. She had been given 17 acres of swamp. She had turned it into a home. And now, as the world around her crumbled under the weight of drought, her home still stood. Her water still flowed. Her land still produced. The curse had become a blessing, and the people who had cursed her were learning slowly and painfully what they had thrown away. The Whitmore farm was dying. Lorena heard about it from the people who came to fill their water barrels. Farmers who had known the Whitmores for decades. Men who had worked alongside Heartland in the fields. Women who had sat beside Parmelia in church. They came to the swamp because they had nowhere else to go. And while they filled their barrels from Willow Creek, they talked. They shared news the way people in small communities always share news, freely, completely, without regard for who might be listening. The well ran dry in July, one man said. He was a neighbor of the Whitmores, a farmer named Hoskins, whose own well had failed a week later. They tried digging deeper, hit rock, could not go any further. The tobacco crop failed completely. Another said, a woman whose husband had once worked as a hired hand on the Whitmore property. Every plant dead in the field. Harlan walked through the rows and did not say a word, just walked and looked and then went back to the house. Lorena listened. She did not ask questions. She did not comment. She simply filled their barrels and sent them on their way. But she remembered. She remembered Harlan's voice in the parlor of the farmhouse reading the deed like a sentence. She remembered Parmelia's hand snatching the doll from Willa's grasp. She remembered Ephraim standing at the window with his back turned, refusing to look at his wife and daughters as they were cast out. And now the wells were dry. The crops were dead. The cattle had been sold at prices that barely covered the cost of transporting them to market. 20 head of cattle gone. The foundation of the Whitmore wealth liquidated for pennies on the dollar. Parmelia was sick. The drought and the stress and the collapse of everything she had known had broken something inside her. She lay in bed most days now, too weak to rise, too proud to admit that she needed help. And Harlan had borrowed against everything he owned. The land, the house, the equipment. He had borrowed believing that the rain would come, that the drought would break, that things would return to normal. The rain had not come. The drought had not broken, and now the debts were due. Ephraim came to the swamp in August. He came alone, walking the 6 miles from the Whitmore farm because the horses were too weak to ride and the wagon was needed for other things. He arrived at the edge of Lorena's property just as the sun was setting, casting long shadows across the water. He stood at the bottom of the ridge, looking up at the cabin, at the smokehouse, at the dock that extended out over the swamp, at the raised beds that were still producing vegetables while farms across the county turned to dust. He did not call out. He simply stood there, waiting. Lorena saw him from the porch. She recognized him immediately despite the changes. 3 years had altered him. He was thinner. His face was lined with worry. His shoulders were hunched in a way they had not been before, as though he was carrying a weight he could not set down. She walked down the ridge to where he stood. Neither spoke for a long moment. "You have done something remarkable here," Ephraim said finally. His voice was quiet, tired. The voice of a man who had been defeated by things he did not understand. Lorena said nothing. "I did not come to ask for anything." He paused, swallowed. "I came to warn you. Father is planning to challenge the deed again. He says it was signed under duress. He has been talking to lawyers in Nashville." "The deed is valid," Lorena said. "He signed it himself, 2 witnesses, registered with the county clerk." "I know. I told him that. But he does not listen to me." Ephraim looked past her at the cabin on the ridge, at the life she had built without him, at the home he had never helped to create. "The girls," he said. "How are they?" "They are well. Do they remember me?" Lorena hesitated. The truth was cruel, but it was still the truth. Ephraim understood before she spoke. "Of course they do not," he said quietly. "Why would they? I stood at that window and watched you leave. I did not visit in 3 years. I did not write. I did not do anything a father should do." He looked at the ground. "I deserve that." "Yes," Lorena said. "You do." He nodded. Then he turned to go. "Ephraim," he stopped. "Tell your father, if he brings lawyers, I will bring lawyers of my own. The deed is solid. He will not win." Ephraim looked at her for a long moment. Then something like a smile crossed his face. Faint, sad, the ghost of an expression that might once have been genuine. "You have changed," he said. "No," Lorena replied. "I have become who I always was. I simply did not have the space to show it before." He walked away into the gathering darkness. His footsteps faded. The sound of his departure was swallowed by the swamp. Lorena watched him go. She felt something she had not expected. Not anger, not bitterness, something like sadness for the man he could have been. For the years wasted because he did not have courage. She turned and walked back up to her cabin, to her daughters, to the life she had built without him. The drought broke in late October. The rains came suddenly, as though the sky had been holding its breath for 6 months and finally exhaled. Water poured down in sheets, filling the dry creek beds, soaking into the parched earth, turning the dusty roads into rivers of mud. But the damage was done. The crops had failed. The livestock had died or been sold. The debts had come due. Across Perry County, families were packing their belongings and heading west. Farms that had been in families for generations were being abandoned. The land that had sustained them had betrayed them, and they did not have the strength to start again. The Whitmore farm held on. Barely. Heartland had managed to avoid foreclosure, but only by selling almost everything he owned. The cattle were gone. The equipment was gone. Most of the hired hands had left seeking work elsewhere. What remained was a shell of what had been. Permelia grew weaker as winter approached. The illness that had taken hold during the drought continued to consume her. She rarely left her bed now. When she did, she moved slowly, carefully, as though her bones had become fragile. And Heartland had become a ghost of himself. The proud man who had read the deed in the parlor was gone. In his place was someone smaller, diminished. A man who had learned too late that pride was a poor substitute for wisdom. The day he came to the swamp, he came alone. It was the last day of November. The sky was gray. The air was cold. Winter was settling over the land like a blanket, muffling sounds, slowing time. Heartland arrived in a wagon driving slowly down the track that led to Lorena's property. The horse was thin. The wagon was battered. Everything about his arrival spoke of desperation. He stopped at the edge of the property. The same place where he had stopped with his lawyers 2 months before. The same place where he had tried to take back what he had given. But this was a different man. The arrogance was gone. The pride was gone. Something essential had broken inside him, and it showed in every line of his face and every movement of his body. He climbed down from the wagon slowly, an old man moving like an old man, without pretense, without the forced vigor that had once characterized him. He walked to the base of the ridge and stopped. He did not climb up. He did not demand. He did not threaten. He simply stood there, looking up at the cabin where his granddaughters lived. at the woman he had cast out, at the land he had called worthless. And he said 6 words. We need to be helped, not we need help. We need to be helped. The distinction was everything. The first was a request. The second was a confession, an admission that he could not do this alone, that he had tried and failed and had nothing left. Lorena stood on the ridge and looked down at him. This was the man who had given her 17 acres of swamp and told her to leave. The man who had called her children disappointments. The man who had tried to take back the land when she succeeded. She could turn him away. She had every right. After everything he had done, after everything he had said, she would be justified in watching him walk away, in letting him face the consequences of his own cruelty. But then Willa appeared at her side. Mama, the 7-year-old said. Her voice was soft, curious. That man looked sad. Lorena looked at her daughter, at this child who had been called a disappointment on the day of her birth, who had learned to survive in a place that was supposed to destroy them, who was growing into someone strong and capable and kind. She thought about the lessons she wanted to teach her daughters, about strength and independence, but also about mercy, about grace, about being better than the people who had hurt you. She thought about Ezra, who had helped her for no reason except that helping was what good people did, about Opaline, who had walked through a storm to save Hetty's life. She thought about the swamp, which had taught her that even the things people throw away can become valuable, that even the places people reject can become sanctuaries. She looked at Harlan Whitmore, and she walked down the ridge to where he stood. What do you need? Harlan could barely meet her eyes. Primelia is very sick. We have no food, no money, nothing left. He paused. His voice broke. I am not asking for myself. I am asking for her. She does not deserve to die because of my mistakes. Lorena was silent for a long moment. The swamp sang around them, the frogs and the birds and the water moving slowly through the channels. Life continuing despite everything. I will give you food, she said finally. Fish, vegetables, eggs. Enough to get through the winter. Harlan's eyes widened. You would do that? After everything, I am not doing it for you, Lorena said. I am doing it because my daughters are watching, and I want them to learn that strength is not the same as cruelty. She turned and walked back up the ridge. Behind her, she heard Harlan say a single word. Thank you. 1 week later, they came again. All of them. Harlan in the wagon driving. Primelia lying in the back wrapped in blankets too weak to sit up. Ephraim sitting beside his mother, steadying her against the jolting of the wheels. They stopped at the base of the ridge. Lorena was waiting. She had known they would come. The food she had given them was enough to survive, but surviving was not the same as living. They needed more than fish and vegetables. They needed shelter. Warmth. The kind of care that could not be loaded into a wagon and sent away. Ephraim climbed down. He looked at Lorena, at the cabin, at the swamp that had sustained what his family's farm could not. Could we stay here? His voice was humble in a way she had never heard before. Just for the winter, until the spring crop comes in. The words hung in the air. Lorena looked at Ephraim, at the wagon, at Primelia's frail form beneath the blankets, at Harlan's bowed head. These were the people who had cast her out, who had called her worthless, who had given her a curse disguised as a gift, and now they were asking for mercy. But then Hetty ran past her. The 5-year-old scrambled down the ridge, her small feet finding purchase on the muddy slope. She stopped at the wagon and looked up at Harlan, at the man who had called her a disappointment on the day she was born. And she held out an egg. Here, Hetty said. Her voice was bright, innocent, untouched by all the cruelty that had come before. Lady laid this one this morning. It is a good one. Harlan looked at the egg in his granddaughter's hand, small and white and perfect, an offering freely given by a child who had no reason to give anything. He looked at the child's face, open and trusting, without malice, without memory of the wounds he had inflicted. His eyes filled with tears. Thank you, he whispered. Lorena watched this. She felt something shift inside her, some final wall falling away, some last piece of resistance crumbling. Not forgiveness, not exactly. The wounds were too deep for that, the memories too sharp, but acceptance. Release, the understanding that holding on to anger was a burden she no longer needed to carry. She had won. Not because they were here, not because they were asking for help. She had won because she had built a life better than the one they had offered her. Because she had taken their curse and transformed it into a blessing. Because her daughters were growing up strong and kind and capable. That was enough. She walked down the ridge. "You can stay," she said. Ephraim's face crumpled with relief. "But there are conditions," Lorena continued. "On this land, there is no master and no servant. There is no man above woman. If you stay here, you work. All of you, as equals." Harlan nodded slowly. And Parmelia from the wagon, her voice weak but clear, said, "I understand." Lorena looked at the woman who had made her eat in the kitchen, the woman who had called her children failures, the woman who had snatched a doll from a 4-year-old's hands. Something in Parmelia's expression had changed. The coldness was gone. The cruelty was gone. In its place was something that looked like regret. Lorena held her gaze for a long moment. Then she nodded. "Come. The cabin has room." The winter of 1888 to 1889 was the hardest any of them had ever known, and the most meaningful. The first week was the most difficult. Harlan had never taken orders from anyone, let alone a woman. His hands fumbled with tasks that Lorena performed without thinking. He could not bait a crawfish trap. He could not check a fish weir without falling into the water. He could not do any of the 100 small things that kept the swamp farm running. Lorena watched him struggle. She could have mocked him. She could have reminded him of every cruel word he had ever spoken, every dismissive glance, every moment of contempt. Instead, she taught him. "Like this," she said, showing him how to set the trap. "The bait goes in the back. The door faces downstream. The crawfish swim in looking for food. They cannot find their way out." Harlan watched her hands. He copied her movements. He failed. He tried again. He failed again. But he did not give up. And by the end of the first week, he could set a trap without help. By the end of the first month, he could check the raised beds and report which plants needed attention. By the end of the winter, he understood something that had never occurred to him in 60 years. The swamp was not chaos. The swamp was a system. And once you understood the system, it gave you everything you needed. One evening, sitting by the fire, Harlan said, "I spent my whole life fighting the land, trying to make it do what I wanted, forcing it to bend to my will." He looked at Lorena. "You work with it, you listen to it, you let it teach you." Lorena nodded. "The land was here before us," she said. "It will be here after us. The only question is whether we learn from it or struggle against it." Harlan was quiet for a long moment. "I wish I had known that 60 years ago." "So do I," Lorena said. "So do I." Parmelia recovered slowly. Rest and food and Opaline's herbal remedies brought her back from the edge. The color returned to her cheeks. The strength returned to her limbs. By February, she could sit up in bed. By March, she could walk to the window and look out at the swamp. But she had changed. The cold, imperious woman who had made Lorena eat in the kitchen was gone. In her place was someone quieter, more thoughtful, someone who seemed to be seeing the world clearly for the first time. One evening, Parmelia asked if she could tell the girls a story. Lorena hesitated. The memory of Parmelia snatching the doll from Willa's hands was still fresh. The cruelty of that moment was still sharp. But she looked at her daughters, at their curious faces, at the way they were watching their grandmother, waiting to see what would happen. She nodded. Parmelia sat by the fire with Willa and Hetty at her feet. The flames cast dancing shadows on the walls. The swamp sang outside the window. And Parmelia told them about her childhood, about the farm where she had grown up, about her mother who had died when she was 7, about the father who had not known how to raise a daughter alone, about the fear that had taken root in her heart and grown into something hard and cold. She told them about learning to survive by being strong, by being hard, by never showing weakness. She told them about the walls she had built around herself, walls that had kept her safe but had also kept her alone. She did not apologize directly. She did not say the words, "I am sorry," but the story itself was an apology. The vulnerability was an offering. The truth was a gift. When she finished, Willa said, "That sounds lonely, grandmother." Parmelia's eyes filled with tears. "It was," she said. "It was very lonely." And then Hetty climbed into her grandmother's lap. You are not lonely now, Hetty said. We are here. Lorena watched this. She felt the last hard knot of anger inside her dissolve. Not forgiveness exactly. The wounds were too deep for that. But something softer. Something that allowed her to breathe more easily. Parmelia had been cruel because she was afraid. She had hurt others because she was hurting. She had built walls because she did not know any other way to survive. It did not excuse what she had done, but it explained it, and sometimes understanding is enough. Spring came early that year, and with it something unexpected. Harlan asked to speak with Lorena alone. They walked to the dock that overlooked the swamp. The water was high with spring rains. The raised beds were ready for planting. Everywhere life was beginning again. Harlan stood for a long moment looking at the wetland that had become her kingdom. Then he spoke. I was wrong. The words hung in the air, not about one thing, about everything. He turned to face Lorena. I told myself that I was protecting the family legacy, that sons were necessary, that daughters were disappointments, that you had failed us, his voice broke. But I was the failure. I could not see what was in front of me. I could not see that my granddaughters are extraordinary. I could not see that you were building something more valuable than anything I ever built. Lorena felt tears in her eyes. I gave you this land to destroy you, Harlan continued. I wanted you to fail. I wanted to be proven right. He looked at the swamp, at the raised beds, at the cabin on the ridge. You were not the one who failed to produce an heir. I was the one who failed to recognize what an heir truly is. Lorena said nothing for a long moment. You do not need to apologize to me, she said finally. You need to apologize to Willa and Hetty. I will. I will spend whatever time I have left trying to be the grandfather they deserve. And Ephraim, he needs to hear this too. Harlan closed his eyes. I told him last night. I told him I was wrong to control him. I told him that if he wanted to be a better man than I was, he would need to find his own way. What did he say? He did not say anything, but he wept. And I think perhaps that was the first honest conversation we have ever had. They stood in silence. The swamp sang around them. The water moved slowly through the channels. Then Harlan said, I do not expect forgiveness. I do not deserve it. But I wanted you to know that I see now. Finally, after all these years, I see. Forgiveness is not something I can give all at once, Lorena said. But I can give you a chance, the same chance this swamp gave me. She gestured at the water. This place taught me that even the things people throw away can become valuable. Maybe people are the same. Harlan nodded. Maybe they are. The weeks passed, the months passed, the seasons turned. Harlan kept his word. He apologized to Willow and Hetty, not once but repeatedly. He taught them what he knew about farming. He told them stories about their ancestors. He became slowly the grandfather he should have been from the beginning. Ephraim tried to rebuild his relationship with his daughters. It was harder. The girls had no memory of him as a father. They had grown up without him. They did not know how to be his children. But he tried. He showed up day after day. He helped with the work. He listened when they spoke. He did not expect them to love him. He simply hoped that someday they might. Parmelia grew stronger. By May, she was working in the raised beds. Her hands, which had never done manual labor, became calloused and strong. She learned to harvest vegetables, to smoke fish, to do the 100 small tasks that kept the farm running. And one day she said to Lorena, I was cruel to you for 5 years. I do not have an excuse. I only have regret. Lorena looked at her. You can be different, she said. That is what the swamp taught me. Nothing is fixed. Everything can change. Parmelia nodded. Tears ran down her cheeks. Thank you for letting us stay, for being better than we were. The years passed. Lorena watched the world around her transform. The people who had mocked her now sought her advice. The techniques she had developed spread throughout the bottomlands. Other farmers began building raised beds, smoking fish, working with the swamp instead of against it. The skeptics changed their tune. Gideon Blackwell stopped laughing at swamp farming. His silence was its own admission. Dr. Ambrose Whitfield wrote a small article about alternative agricultural methods. He did not mention Lorena by name, but everyone knew. Reverend Tatum added a new line to his sermons. God's designs are often larger than we understand. Opal Kincaid became one of Lorena's most loyal customers. She never apologized, but she stopped gossiping. That was enough. Luther Doss paid his $5 bet. Then he asked Lorena to teach him to build raised beds. She taught him. She taught anyone who asked, because knowledge shared is knowledge multiplied, and she wanted her knowledge to outlive her. Flint died in the winter of 1893. He was 11 years old, a Dolomitigapo. His muzzle had gone completely white, his step had slowed. The leg that had been caught in the trap all those years ago had begun to pain him when the weather turned cold. On the morning he died, he did not get up. Lorena knew before she touched him. There was a stillness that spoke of finality, a peace that only comes when the struggle is over. She sat beside him anyway, stroking his fur, remembering the trap in the willows, the brown eyes watching her as she freed him, the nights he had pressed against her side, keeping her warm, keeping her safe. He had been with her through everything. He had found her when she was lost. He had protected her daughters. He had warned her of danger. He had been her companion in a place where companions were rare. She buried him on the ridge beside Ezra, who had passed the year before. The old man had died quietly in his sleep in the cabin where he had lived for 40 years. Lorena had found him on a Tuesday morning, his face peaceful, his hands folded on his chest. She had buried him on the high ground beside the tulip poplars, and now Flint lay beside him. Willa, now 12, placed a stone on the grave. She had carved words into it with patient, careful strokes. Flint, loyal friend, 1885 to 1893. Hetty, now 10, stood silently beside her sister. Her face was wet with tears, but she did not sob. She had learned in her 10 years that grief was a river that must be allowed to flow. He found us, Hetty said, or we found him. I am glad either way. Permelia died in the spring of 1894. She had lived 5 more years than anyone expected. 5 years to become a different person. 5 years to know her granddaughters. 5 years to make peace with the woman she had wronged. Her last days were peaceful. She lay in the bed in the addition that Lorena had built, looking out the window at the swamp. The water was high with spring rains. The raised beds were green with new growth. Life was beginning again. Lorena sat with her in the final hours. I was wrong about you, Permelia said. Her voice was barely a whisper. Wrong about everything. But I am grateful. Grateful for this time. Grateful for the chance to know my granddaughters. Grateful that you let us stay. Lorena took her hand. I am grateful too, she said, and she meant it. Permelia closed her eyes. They buried her on the ridge. 4 graves now. Ezra and Flint and Permelia. A strange family bound not by blood but by circumstance. By the swamp that had brought them together. Heartland lived until 1901. He spent his last years on the swamp, working in the raised beds, tending the fish traps. He had become, in his own way, a student of the land. The pride that had defined him for 60 years had been replaced by something softer. A willingness to learn, a humility that came from understanding how much he had missed. On his last day, he sat on the dock and watched the sunset over the swamp. The sky was gold and orange and pink. The water reflected the colors like a mirror. The birds were settling into the trees for the night. The frogs were beginning their evening chorus. This he said to Lorena, who sat beside him. This is the most beautiful thing I have ever seen. I know, she said. He was quiet for a long moment. I wasted so many years looking at the wrong things, he said. Chasing things that did not matter. Throwing away things that did. He gestured weakly at the swamp. And all this time, the real treasure was right here. Not the land, not the timber, not the property. He looked at her. You, the girls, the family I almost lost. Lorena took his hand. You did not lose us, she said. You are here, he smiled. It was a gentle smile, a peaceful smile, the smile of a man who had finally found his way home. Thanks to you, he said. He died that night, quietly, in his sleep. His face peaceful, his hands folded on his chest. They buried him on the ridge with the others. 5 graves now, Ezra and Flint and Permelia and Heartland. And a space beside them waiting. By 1895, 10 years after she had arrived with nothing, Lorena's techniques had spread throughout the bottomlands of Perry County. 7 families were farming the wetlands using raised beds. 12 families were smoking fish for market. Emmett Yancey had built his own swamp farm and was teaching others. The swamp was no longer a curse. It was a blessing, and everyone knew who had shown them the way. Scholars came from the University of Tennessee. They measured the soil. They analyzed the water. They documented the yields. They asked questions that Lorena did not always understand about pH levels and nutrient cycling and aquatic ecosystems. But they understood what mattered. They understood that Lorena had discovered something important, something that could help other people in other places, something that would outlast her. The principles she discovered, they wrote in their report, remain relevant today. The integration of aquaculture and agriculture, the use of natural pest control, the recognition of wetland soil fertility, these insights were ahead of their time. Lorena smiled when she heard that. She had never thought of herself as ahead of her time. She had simply been a woman who was thrown away by people who did not understand her value. A woman who was given a curse and turned it into a blessing. Willa married in 1900, a man named Thomas Ashford, a school teacher from the county seat. He was kind and patient and understood that Willa was not like other women, that she could fish and farm and build with her hands, that she did not need protection, that she needed partnership. They built a house on the ridge, not far from the cabin where Willa had grown up. They had 3 children, 2 boys and a girl. The girl was named Lorena. Hetty married 2 years later, a farmer's son named James Morton. He had come to the swamp to learn raised bed farming, and he had stayed because of Hetty, because of her laugh, because of the way she named all the ducks, because of the joy she found in simple things. They took over the main cabin when they married. They continued the work that Lorena had begun. The raised beds, the fish traps, the smokehouse, the endless cycle of planting and harvesting and preserving. Lorena watched her daughters grow into women, watched her grandchildren come into the world, watched the swamp continue to provide year after year, generation after generation. She had been given 17 acres of swamp. She had turned it into a legacy. Lorena died in the winter of 1920. She was 60 years old. Her hair had gone completely white. Her hands were gnarled from decades of work. Her face was lined with the marks of sun and wind and time. But her eyes were still clear, still sharp, still seeing things that other people missed. She died in her cabin, the same cabin she had built in 1885. The logs had darkened with age, but they were still strong. The chinking had been replaced several times, but the structure remained. The windows still faced west, and every evening the sunset still poured through, filling the room with gold. Willa was with her at the end, and Hetty, and grandchildren and great-grandchildren who had been told stories about the woman who built a paradise from a swamp. "I am not sad," Lorena said. Her voice was soft but clear. "I have lived a good life. I have loved and been loved. I have built something that will last." She looked at her daughters, at the faces that had grown from children to women, at the hands that had learned to do everything she had taught them. "Remember," she said, "the things people call worthless may be the most valuable things of all. The places they reject may be the places where life grows best. And the people they throw away may be the people who change everything." She smiled. "I was thrown away, and look what I became." She died that night, peacefully, in her sleep, her face peaceful, her hands folded on her chest. They buried her on the ridge beside Ezra and Flint and Permelia and Heartland. 5 graves on the high ground. 5 people who had found each other in a place that the world had rejected. 5 lives that had been transformed by the swamp that refused to be worthless. The swamp is still there. The ridge still rises along the eastern edge. The tulip poplars that Lorena refused to sell have grown massive, their trunks 6 feet in diameter, their branches reaching toward the sky. The cabin has been restored and preserved. The Perry County Historical Society maintains it as a museum. Visitors come from around the country. They walk the dock that Lorena built. They read the historical markers. They stand at the graves on the ridge. 5 graves, Ezra and Flint and Permelia and Harlan and Lorena. A family that began in cruelty and ended in redemption. In 1978, researchers from the University of Tennessee published a study on wetland agriculture. They cited Lorena's methods extensively. The principles she discovered, they wrote, remain relevant today. The integration of aquaculture and agriculture, the use of natural pest control, the recognition of wetland soil fertility. These insights were ahead of their time. Lorena would have smiled at that. She had never thought of herself as ahead of her time. She was simply a woman who had been thrown away by people who did not understand her value. A woman who had been given a curse and turned it into a blessing. Swamp is not a word that people use when they are giving you something valuable. But sometimes the things people call worthless are the most valuable things of all. Sometimes the places people reject are the places where life grows best. And sometimes the people who are thrown away are the people who change everything. Lorena was thrown away, and look what she became.